want to bring attention to something else we've got working, and that's our Florida Black History YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and search Florida Black History, previous episodes of ours will come up related to a variety of topics: American Beach and Zora Neale Hurston and the Dozier School, and on and on and on and on it goes. Well, this one is destined to be up there in short order. We're talking about the Reconstruction period, the period right after the Civil War. And what do you do with all of these suddenly emancipated former Black enslaved people, Craig?
Yeah, and our guest Robert Macomber has done a tremendous study of this and goes around giving lectures about it, which is, that's not the way he makes a living, but it's something he feels strongly about, and so I'm so happy he agreed to share it with us.
Yeah, Robert's an author. He's an expert and a lecturer on naval affairs and military affairs, but he is a historian as well. Grew up on Pine Island in Southwest Florida, and that's where he joins us from today to talk about this incredibly little known and essential piece of Florida history, yes, but more broadly, American history.
Thanks so much for joining us to talk about this. This is an important but little known facet of Florida history, and I think more people should know about it. Let me start off by asking you, how did you get interested in the Reconstruction era in Florida?
I'm a historian. I'm a lecturer, and my specialty area is basically Victorian and Edwardian world history. But I also specialize in Florida history because I'm from here. I grew up here, and I've been fascinated by it. And so this kind of mixes in with all of that because it's American history, it's Florida history, and because Florida is in the location that it is in, it also involves other countries and things like that. So people have long asked me, "Oh, was Florida in the Civil War?" Which just aggravates me no end.
I can
And then
imagine.
when I say yes, they say, "Well, what side was it on?" And so,
Really?
oh, I've had many media interviews when they ask me that. And so, evidently, history was not one of the subjects taught at journalism school. I don't know. And so, I think I noticed there was a gap in Florida history. When I grew up, it was not talked about in school. And most of the people that I know that grew up here, natives and transplants, have no clue about it. And we have to look back in history to understand why we are the way we are. So, and why we are located where we're at and why we do things. So I thought that this was a very needed subject. And I noticed that I'll be polite, in recent years, there has been an effort to try to ignore history or quash history of our state. And so this is one of those topics that is uncomfortable enough that some people want to quash it, and I don't think it should be.
Before we go any further and dig specifically into our topic of enslaved people who became free and then settled around Florida, Reconstruction. Okay, this is a period of American history we hear about. It comes after the Civil War, but then when does it stop and what did it do?
Right.
Give me Cliff Notes on Reconstruction for folks listening, so we have some context here.
Okay. Reconstruction is the term that is given to the post-war, post-Civil War period in the South. And the South was occupied by the United States Army, and much of the South was devastated, particularly in the Central South and Upper South. And Florida escaped a lot of the devastation, but we still had some disruption, devastation, economic problems. So since we were part of the South, we were under occupation also. And the occupation started in May about a month after Lee surrendered. People think that the war ended when Lee surrendered. That is not true. The war continued all the way until June in various places in the South. And in Florida, it continued on for about another month into May. In May, the U.S. Army occupied Tallahassee. They tried invading to capture it during the war 3 times, but they were repelled all 3 times. And so in May, the Army takes over, and it's commanded in Florida by a general named McCook, who was from Ohio originally and was a cavalry officer during the war. So General McCook realized that the people, white people and black people of Florida, many of them did not know about the Emancipation Proclamation that had been in effect in Union operated and occupied areas for the last year and a half. So he issued a proclamation on May 20th from his headquarters in Tallahassee. You can still go to this headquarters. It is a historical house on Park Avenue in downtown Tallahassee. And he called attention to everybody that black people were now free all over the state of Florida. And that is why, to this very day, 160 years later, we have Emancipation Day in Florida as May 20th.
Interesting.
And it gets celebrated every year in May 20th. You may have heard of the term Juneteenth, which has become pretty well known in the last several years. And in the previous federal administration was made a national holiday. Juneteenth refers to June 19th, which was the Emancipation Day in Texas, when the proclamation was issued there. Texas and Florida were the only 2 states in the Confederacy that did not have their capitals captured by battle. And so our 2 states were the last 2 states really to have that proclamation, which had been given in January of 1863, but to have it formally proclaimed to the people of both of our states, Florida and Texas.
And then to go into any sort of effect, Lincoln can say,
Right.
anything he wants, but, the southern states were still in a state of rebellion. So I think there's a misnomer that it's the Emancipation Proclamation, and then all black people are free and start forming businesses and getting together and having parties. No.
So that the proclamation only applied to areas under Union control, only under United States control. So because Texas and Florida were not under that control until the very end of the war, we were the last ones. So that's why Juneteenth, which has become famous and now is a national holiday, and also May 20th in Florida. That was celebrated by black communities all the way up until about World War II. It's not so much anymore, but with a new emphasis in some communities, they're remembering their history. So the Reconstruction went on in Florida, not as long as it went on in other southern states. In other southern states, it continued all the way until 1876. So you have 1865 to 1876. In Florida, the Reconstruction generally ended in 1872. Now, there was a really important part of the Reconstruction, and that important part was the brainchild of President Abraham Lincoln. And 5 weeks before Lincoln was assassinated in 1865 in April, even before the war ended, he had designated a very interesting man to head a brand new bureau. And the name of the bureau is commonly called the Freedmen's Bureau. But that's not actually what the original name was. The original name was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. So that man who was chosen by Abraham Lincoln to head this up was a guy named Oliver Otis Howard, O.O. Howard. And O.O. Howard is one of my favorite people in history. O.O. Howard was from Maine, and he ended up going to the U.S. Military Academy. And right after he graduated in 1855 and became a second lieutenant, he was assigned to the Third Seminole War in Tampa, Florida, and he was stationed at Fort Brooke in Tampa. During that tour of duty, during the third phase of the 22-year-long Seminole War, he ended up moving his wife, who gave birth to the first white child at Fort Brooke. And he had his family with him. His wife was a person of faith, and they attended the Methodist Church in Tampa. And that's where O.O. Howard became a person of faith. And so he was one of those people who was very, very, actually, it was, by the way, I should correct that. That was the Methodist Episcopal Church. And so he was very decent, and he was also a very determined person. So he got his faith when he served in Florida just before the Civil War. And then during the Civil War, he ended up becoming a very well-known man, a very well-known commanding general. And at the Battle of Fair Oaks in June of 1862, he was wounded catastrophically, and he lost his left arm. But the determination showed, and within 6 months, he was back on duty and back in combat, leading men as a general. And he continued through the war. At the end of the war, he was a major general. And that was the man that Lincoln picked to do this impossible job that nobody wanted. He demonstrated his decency and his determination. He was commonly known as the Christian general or as Old Prayer Book. But he wasn't one of those kind of guys that hits you over the head with it. He was actually very quiet and decent about it, but he just believed in doing the right thing. So now he's head of this new Freedmen's Bureau. What do you do? Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to work with white refugees that were displaced persons, and also these new citizens, these slaves turned citizens. It was a daunting task, but O.O. Howard was the guy for it, and he swung into it. He was still on active duty. And who was going to do this? It was the U.S. Army. There wasn't anybody else. So the U.S. Army assigned officers who had no training in this, but had to learn on the job. And all the southern states, all the Confederate states that were under military occupation, ended up with state level and local level freedmen's bureaus. Now, after McCook issued that proclamation, that's not when the Freedmen's Bureau started in Florida. McCook did that proclamation in May 20th, Emancipation Day for Florida. It wasn't until the fall in September when Thomas Ward Osborne, who was an artilleryman, he was originally a lawyer from New Jersey and from New York State. He joined the Army at the beginning of the war. And while he was in the United States, he served in the artillery. He commanded various artillery units, rising in rank until he was the commander of all artillery for General O.O. Howard's a U.S. Army Corps, which was comprised of 3 divisions. So that was a large amount of men and also, of course, artillery. He was very trusted by O.O. Howard, and O.O. Howard sent him to the farthest extremity of the Confederacy, Florida, and told him to do his best. He gave him Army officers, and also the Army occupation forces in Florida came under a lot of his control. The Army in Florida, the U.S. Army in Florida, mainly had Black troops, quite a few of whom were former slaves who had escaped and then joined the Army.
Hmm.
After the war, the ranks of the units in the U.S. Army in Florida were swelled by former slaves that joined the Army also after the war.
Before you
These,
go on, let me ask you, how many slaves were in Florida at this time?
well, we know through the census of 1860 that there were 61,745 slaves.
Wow.
Now, yes, Florida had the lowest white population. We had 77,700 white people, and we had a total population of 140,000 people. We had the smallest population in the Confederacy. We had the smallest white population, and we had the 5th largest ratio of slaves to white people in all of the Confederacy. So we had, in the 20 years before the Civil War, we had a big influx of slavery in Florida with the opening up of central Florida. And we had 70 plantations of 1,000 acres or more.
Wow.
There are some remnants of them that people can visit today, but the best, in my opinion, is Gamble Plantation. Have you been there, Craig?
I have not. I'm
Oh, you should.
boycotting. I'm boycotting, quite frankly. It
Okay.
just strikes me that probably should not be a state park, but that's just me.
Well, it's a state historical site.
Yeah.
So, but it was under the care of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, but they didn't have the money to do it well. And so it was built in 1844. It's an antebellum plantation. And so the state does a good job of maintaining it, which is, it's 100 and what, 80 years old. And it's a daunting task. And they do a pretty good job. I give them credit for that. So this was from central and northern Florida. This was a part of the Cotton South. In southern Florida, particularly in Key West, that was part of the Caribbean. And the economics reflected that. And so there were slaves in Monroe County and in Key West too. By the way, there were 61,745 slaves. There were also 932 free people of color. Most of them were in towns. And I know Tallahassee or Key West had 230, I think, free Black people. So anyway, Osborne gets this job of taking care of 61,745 people. And first he has to find them, sure they all know they're free, and then help them. The job was to assimilate them into, quote, modern society. These people that had been living a subsistence kind of very basic level, they were forbidden for hundreds of years to ever learn how to read.
Yes.
They were, and if you were a white person and you taught them how to read, you were going to jail. And so they were taught certain parts of the Bible that were comfortable with the Southern slave owners' creed, where nothing that was about any kind of rebellions, nothing about the slaves of ancient Egypt, the Jewish diaspora, the Jewish uprising, the Jewish escape through the Red Sea, the Jewish escape from Babylon, that never was taught. Only taught certain parts of the Bible. So these people knew there were other parts of the Bible. They'd heard rumors. And one of the reasons they wanted to read was they wanted to read the Bible themselves. So the Freedmen's Bureau had several things that they had to do. First off, they had to feed people.
Mm-hmm.
They distributed 760,000 rations inside Florida for about a year and a half to 2 years. That's a phenomenal logistical effort. Phenomenal. It amazes me to this day.
It would be today, to say nothing of 1865. And
Right.
and what you're talking about, and I'm going to let you keep going, but I want this is a important distinction that I think most people lose when we think about emancipation and what followed the Civil War. In Florida, 61,000 formerly enslaved people. Extrapolate that across the South, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people.
No,
They
millions.
cannot read. They cannot write. They own no property. They own no land, and they are not welcome. It's not like, Appomattox comes and then Johnny Reb puts his arm around his formerly enslaved person and says, "Come here, brother, let's work towards making a great America." The African Americans who are right now granted citizenship and said, "There you go, land of milk and honey, American dream," they are starting from absolute scratch, like you said, down to the point where they have been forbidden for generations from learning how to read and learning how to write. So when we think about where African American citizens, residents of the South of Florida started from,
Yes.
that's where they started from, and that's why the federal government needed to give some sort of assistance here, because you can't start there and get anywhere without any kind of help.
Yes. A lot of people don't realize that for 30 years after the Civil War, the major portion of a state's budget went into taking care of their former Confederate soldiers and the retirements and pensions. That was the major portion of a state's budget. And so the federal government had to come in, and the federal government had to take over and do the whole thing. There wasn't anybody else to do it. And there was only one group, one organization that had the, the officers were all, excuse me, they were all educated. And so they, even though they didn't have training in this, effectively nation building or culture building, they went into it with a will, and they kept the peace in addition to trying to raise up the former slaves. So first thing they have to do is feed them. Second thing they have to do is do medical care for them. We're dealing with former slaves who understood bush medicine, but they didn't understand or trust the quote modern medicine of the 1860s. So that actually, the feeding was a big success. The medical care was not, and they couldn't get a lot of the former slaves to trust them with some of their medicines and some of their treatments. That was a big problem. Of course, none of them were vaccinated. And yes, they did have vaccines back in those days for smallpox and things like that. And in 1865, there was a smallpox epidemic in Florida. And many Floridians were wary of vaccines, both white and black Floridians. And so that was a big problem, and that was a failure. They couldn't get people to trust them, both white and black, in the U.S. Army doctors. Then they also took care of legal needs for these former slaves. When a former slave is suddenly declared emancipated, where is he going to live?
Yes.
He doesn't own any land, as you just said. He doesn't have a home. He doesn't know where to go. He's going to stay on or near the plantation. And so his new employer was his former slave master. It's the same guy. So the slave masters initially didn't know what to do either. How do I treat this person? Do I actually have to pay him? Where's the money going to come from? The slave owners don't have any, former slave owners don't have any money. The economy's in a ruin. No, there is no economy. It's barter. It's gotten down to barter kind of things. So what they did was they did sharecropper kind of things, where the employees, the former slaves, would get some of the profits, if there were profits, from the sale of the crop, be it cotton in Upper Florida, or rice or sugar cane or whatever. So the many of the former slave owners, who are now the employers, never did a contract. They'd never made a contract. They didn't know how to make a contract. The slaves don't know how to make a contract. So the U.S. Army officers have to step in and come in with contracts, sample standardized contracts that they printed up. Well, Osborne was a former lawyer. And so Osborne,
man for the job. Yeah.
Osborne comes up with a standard contract. And it's really interesting in my lecture of imagery of this. And it's fill in the blank. But it's also interesting that in order to keep the peace with the white people, most of the contractual obligations in that contract are on the part of the employee, not the employer. So they promise, it's in writing, they will not be lazy. They will show up on time. They will, da, 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 da. So these contracts were widespread in Florida. There's some really good imagery of them. And they provided not perfect protection legally, but better than they had. So then there were several. So now we've covered feeding, medical, contracts, and now let's go on to land. There was a lot of public land, both federal and state, in the peninsula of Florida. And there was a law, you may have heard of it, the Homestead Law. And, you've heard of 40 acres and a mule. Mm-hmm. Well, soldiers in the U.S. Army were given that. They had opportunities to get in on that. And also former slaves. The Freedmen's Bureau offered land grants to the former slaves. These people already knew how to grow crops. They already knew how to grow crops, and all they needed was their own land. They had to build their own log cabins, and most of them looked like shanties. But then again, most of the poor white people lived in shanties too. Mm-hmm. And they were given tens of acres of land. And by 1867, Florida had more black landowners than any other Confederate state. Wow. Over 3,000. Over 3,000 got that land.
Wow.
So that was a big success. It didn't last that long. By 1870, about 2/3 of those farms had failed. Now, there are various reasons for the failure. There's a lack of capital. There's a lack of, investment. And also there's a cultural problem. Who are you going to sell the crops to? White people? They're not going to buy. So in many cases, they were shunned. So that was a problem. And money management. Where do you keep your money? Where do you get a loan? Where do you do all the things that farmers usually do? And that white farmers had been doing for decades. That was all closed to the freed slaves. So the Freedmen's Bureau had to start up banks.
Wow.
And they did start up banks. And they actually they didn't run the banks themselves, but they supported the banks, protected the banks, and encouraged the former slaves to use the banks for loans and also for savings accounts. So that was a success. The education thing was a success. I find this interesting. Within 4 years, 169 schools in Florida had taught almost 10,000 former slaves and had raised the literacy rate of those former slaves in Florida up to 16%. From nothing, from zero to 16% in 4 years. I think that's amazing. And by the way, one of the first books that they used was the Bible.
Of course.
And the officers generally were not teaching. What they did was they relied upon missionaries from up north, and most of the missionaries were women. And most of them were also Methodist Episcopal. Nowadays, we call them United Methodist. Full disclosure, I'm a Methodist. But the Methodist Episcopal churches from up north sent women down to deal with the situation, to teach the freedmen, to teach them modern hygiene and sanitary methods, to teach them reading, writing, and basic math, to teach them and also do religious classes for them, teach them the Bible, all the Bible, not just certain parts of it. And they were a huge success. These women endured all kinds of threats. There weren't enough Army soldiers around from the U.S. Army to protect them all. So many of them were working in rural areas by themselves. And I have a lot of respect for them. So we see all these things coming together with all of these aspects that these Army officers and these volunteer teachers are trying to do. And from 1865 to about 1872, we see that former slaves are now thinking of themselves as citizens. They're voting. They're actually running for office. And in some areas where there were more slaves than there were white people, they're winning. And they are in the Republican Party. They're in Lincoln's party. They are not in the Democrat Party because that was the party of slavery. That was the party of the slave owners. So they are pretty solid Republicans. And we start to see by 1872 the rise over the previous couple of years of the Ku Klux Klan.
Before we get into that, could we mention one of the office holders, Josiah Walls, I think, was the first Black congressman from Florida. He was elected during this year.
Yes, and there were a number of Black office holders all the way up until the early 1890s. The sheriff of Monroe County in the early 1890s was a Black man in Key West.
Wow.
The sheriff of Duval County in Jacksonville was a Black man. And so we start to see these former slaves think of themselves as citizens. they are now slowly but surely assimilating into the structure, and the inevitable happens. And the inevitable is the backlash.
Backlash to any progressive movement, and we are experiencing it in 2025 and have been for the past 10 years. There is always a backlash to progress. And that backlash is going to explain the obvious question everyone has. Well, why did this end?
It ended politically, and it ended in Florida about 1872. Much of the efforts initially were based on they were centered on emergency kind of assistance, health, feeding, making sure that they were protected physically. By the late 1860s, we start to see in the United States Congress, first off, there has been a general amnesty for Confederate officers and Confederate office holders. And there are amnesties going in Confederate states to the states that rejoined the United States. People have to remember that when Florida seceded, we were the third state to secede, long before some of the famous Confederate states. We literally renounced our American citizenship. We renounced the United States government, and we got ready to make war on the United States Army. So states from the Confederacy were allowed to rejoin the United States, and Florida was one of the very first. But they had to have a constitution, a state constitution, that reflected the United States Constitution's basic guarantees for citizens. And after the war ended, there were several United States Constitution, federal Constitution amendments that guaranteed voting rights for former slaves, and all civil rights for former slaves. So each state had to guarantee that in their state constitution. Well, in 1868, Florida has a committee formed to help form a constitution. The economy has started to come back, particularly in the Panhandle, through timber and turpentine. And we're starting to see the economy come back in the Jacksonville area. Tampa is getting larger now because it's starting to expand. Key West is back to its normal bustling self. And in 1868, the committee relies upon a guy named Thomas Ward Osborne, Colonel Osborne, because remember what he was? He was a lawyer.
Yeah.
And he got to write the draft of the Florida Constitution. And they adopted that in 1868. And so in 1868, we ended up rejoining the United States before a lot of other states did. And at that point, most of the peacekeeping Army units were withdrawn from Florida. There was certainly need for them in other places. The last of them was withdrawn in 1872. Now, there were still U.S. Army installations in Florida, in Key West, in St. Augustine, in Pensacola, so that if there need be some sort of military intervention in order to keep the peace, they could do it, but it was going to take a while for them to get there. So in 1872, by 1872, we see all the other efforts at education and some of the other land distribution with the Freedmen's Bureau just dwindle to nothing. And by 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau pretty much stops most of its operations. In Florida. It stopped all of its operations in the South in 1876. And in 1876, That was a contested presidential election.
Sounds familiar.
Yes, actually, it gets even better, Craig. One of the states where there was, it was so close that both sides were claiming victory was Florida. Yeah, I know. So there was a compromise. The election of 1876 for president went into the House of Representatives
Hmm.
and was decided there.
Who
And
were the
there were
contestants? Was Grant one of them?
no Grant had served 2 terms, and his term ended in 1876. So it was actually it ended in March 4th, 1877. That was Inauguration Day back then.
Mm-hmm.
So it was Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican, and I'm sorry,
Samuel Tilden.
Tilden. Thank you very
Yep.
much, Samuel Tilden. So the House of Representatives by this point had a sizable Democratic contingent, and from the South,
Mm-hmm.
the solid South, and they put together a deal. We will let the Republican be president if he promises to end, quote, Reconstruction and the
Mm-hmm.
military occupation of the South
Mm-hmm.
and withdraw all the occupation troops, not from the military installations, but stationed in various other places, the peacekeeping troops.
Mm-hmm. Which were
And
dispersed, like you said, widely throughout the South.
yes, so
Keeping law and order, which used to mean something essentially preventing, vigilante violence against the formerly enslaved people.
and by that point, the Ku Klux Klan was very much alive and active and causing terrible destruction and terrible death and mayhem throughout the South. And it only got worse. Yeah, that was started in 1868 and up in Tennessee, and it was in Florida by 1869. And I cover that in this lecture that I do. So we see the political forces in Washington have agreed on this. So Rutherford B. Hayes ends up becoming president. Now, we had Republican presidents from 1860 all the way up until 1884 with Grover Cleveland, who served 1 term then and then another term later on. There was a time period in between. So we have Hayes, President Hayes, does what he has agreed to do. He ends the Reconstruction, he ends the occupation, and now the political leadership of the South is in the Democratic hands. There still are Black Republicans. They still are winning some local elections, but statewide, it's pretty much a lock. And by the end of the 1870s and into the 1880s, you start to see fewer and fewer Black rights. By the 1880s, you start to see all kinds of voter repression laws. You had to, yeah, the Jim Crow laws started. Many people don't know who Jim Crow was. Jim Crow was the stage name of a white comedian, actor, singer in the 1830s who did blackface and made Black people look stupid. And everybody would laugh at them. And he was from Ohio, and he was a very big success up north too. So now we have the end of the Freedmen's Bureau, but there is still some legacies that go on. We see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, Sarasota, Florida in the 1880s and 1890s was called Bloody Sarasota, because if you were a Republican, you had a target on your back, Black or white Republican. There were vigilante gangs called regulators that were crisscrossing the state. Florida had a terrible history of lynchings, of outright massacres, of mass murders. Rosewood is a big example of that. In the 1920s, Ocoee, near Orlando, but there were many, many. 333 Black people were lynched in Florida after the absence of the federal troops, all the way until the 1950s. So Florida was very much a part of that. But the good legacy is there are schools that were started by the Freedmen's Bureau and the Methodist Episcopal Church missionaries that still exist today. And one of the most famous in Florida was originally called the Cookman Institute, which was named after a man who was a Methodist missionary who came down to teach former slaves, a man named Cookman, in Jacksonville. And he started this school, which became then an institute of higher learning, in addition to teaching primary and secondary students. And it was called the Cookman Institute. And we now know it as the Bethune-Cookman University, or college. So Mary McLeod Bethune partnered with that institute in the 1920s and 30s and gave her name to it also. So that's just one of the legacies. There is a wonderful legacy in rural Black families that still live on the homestead. There were about 1,600 of them that, when the Freedmen's Bureau left, still owned those homesteads. And so many of those are still in the families, and they still are farmers. And I think that's a wonderful legacy.
Yeah.
There's a national legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau, and this incredible effort, this regional, I should say, regional effort to assimilate slaves into citizens. And that is O.O. Howard's university that he started in Washington, D.C.
No kidding. Howard University. Is that
O.O.
right?
And the O.O. Howard house where he lived is still there. And that was it was a major university. It was the first one for Black people. And it was a progressive university in the medical school, because there were no Black medical schools. And so that medical school was one of the pioneers in women's medical health, medical care. The white schools didn't have women's medical care sections in their medical schools. Howard University was one of the very first that did. Now, white women wouldn't go to O.O. Howard Medical Center to get treated because of the racial makeup of it. But many Black women did, and they were treated and successfully. So we have these kinds of legacies: the schools, the homesteads, the universities. This is when the historically Black colleges and universities started. This is how they started, through the Freedmen's Bureau. And so there are legacies to this very day. Yeah. And we've overcome a lot in this state. We've gotten much better at many things. I agree with you on the last 10 years. History has been either quashed or ignored because it's uncomfortable, which is not the way it should be. And that's why I felt the call to do a lecture series on slavery in Florida. And it's a 3-part lecture series. And this is the last part of it. I do one whole lecture on what slavery was like during the war. And I do one on the unsung heroes of the U.S. Navy who were on the anti-slavery patrol, much of which was headquartered out of Key West. And there are remarkable stories in Key West of the anti-slavery patrol and of the Key Westers taking care of slaves that were liberated from slave ships. These people couldn't even walk. they had to be carted ashore in wheelbarrows. And many of them died once they got to freedom, but they died free in Key West. And there is a cemetery in Key West that was found finally about 25 years ago by a historian who was a friend of mine, and he worked at the Mel Fisher Museum. And he used ground penetrating radar. And it's at near Smathers Beach, near the West Martello Tower, if you know Key West. It's a mass grave of about 150 freed slaves. They were freed at sea, and they died when they got on shore.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Oof,
It's a very, very poignant place. And I always urge people to go there and maybe say a prayer or something.
Yeah, I have the feeling Craig and I could keep firing questions at you for the rest of the afternoon, but why don't we wrap it up right there? Well, this has been a good one. Robert Macomber has been our guest. I've got a link to find him online in the show notes. Thank you so much, not only for sharing what you've learned with us today, but the work you've done to keep this essential history alive and remembered.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here with both of you. I greatly respect you and all the work that you two do. Thanks.
Thank you.
A lot to chew on there, Craig, for
Oh
sure.
yeah, yeah, definitely, and ties to lots of our other shows. The show we did about lynching in Florida, the show
Sure.
about the Civil War in Florida, the show we did
Klan.
about show we did about the Klan, show
Mm,
we did about Kingsley Plantation, which was one of
absolutely.
the pre-war plantations.
Yeah, Rosewood, Tampa Sit-In, Sarasota Black History, Mary McLeod Bethune. We've done all
Yes.
those kinds of episodes before. And again, this ties back to what we mentioned earlier in the episode, our Florida Black History channel on YouTube. If this is the sort of thing that interests you and you want to learn more, a great starter course. We've got about 30 of our previous episodes related to Black history in Florida. Go to YouTube, search at Florida Black History.
He mentioned about the rural farming communities. I know one of them. It's the town of Royal. They were threatened by the DOT that was going to build a new toll road right through the middle of the place, wipe out their cemetery, wipe out one of their churches, and they stood up to the DOT and backed them down and said, "No, you will not come through here. You will not destroy our history." It was an inspiring place to visit. Let me tell you.
Welcome to Florida.
Welcome to Florida.